I mentioned, well, I told you that I was going to kind of show you how I think as I write. And so I've taken some, they're not really the original notes, and so they're clearer than if I really had my original notes, but they're in my textbook. I just made a few modifications today. These are notes from a story I wrote many years ago. Let me give you a little bit of background so you understand. In America, we have a public school system like most countries, and everybody has to pay taxes for it. But some people, even if they're not well-to-do, not rich by any means, they don't like the public school system. They don't think it's very good, and so they would rather send their children to a private school. And in fact, there is over a million. There are over a million families who school their children at home. Part of that is a belief that, and there's some accuracy to this, teachers, along with professors in America, tend to be quite liberal, which in America, whether you're liberal or conservative, depends on the society that you're in. In America, I'm conservative. I have conservative traditions. I'm religious. Uh, I'm against things like abortion, and so in America that makes me a conservative. In Kazakhstan, where I taught for 9 years, I'm a liberal because I'm for free speech and free press and free meetings and so forth. And there they have a somewhat repressive government. In fact, they only had one president for the first 20 plus years of their existence, who happened to be also the Communist Party chair of that country before the fall of the Soviet Union. So he's been their leader for close to 25 years, and he just stepped down, and they're having an election for a new president, and there are demonstrations going on that they consider illegal. People are being put in jail right now as we speak. Well, maybe not today. Yesterday they had their election, and there were people protesting, and they were put in jail. So in Kazakhstan, I'm a liberal. In America, I'm a conservative. I'm the same person. So it's kind of hard sometimes to explain. I don't want to go into all the detail what makes me a conservative, but I kind of gave you an idea already. I think I may have mentioned before also that in America, liberals have taken over some of the key parts of society. They have taken over Hollywood, like 9 to 1. There are 9 liberals in Hollywood to 1 conservative. There are 4 liberal journalists to 1 conservative journalist. There are 4 liberal professors in universities to 1 conservative professor. I haven't seen a poll in public schools as far as in the kindergarten to 12th grade, but it's pretty well acknowledged that that's also controlled by liberals. Not all of them, and I'm not sure it's as much as in the universities. I just have not seen a survey, but they do tend to control the public schools as well. And they also control the government bureaucracy. So even though Trump is president, for example, a lot of stuff he can't get done because his own bureaucracy is protected under the Civil Service Act, which means it's almost impossible to fire somebody that works for the government. And over the years, it has become more and more controlled by the Democrats. So even though there's a Republican conservative president, he doesn't control the government to a large degree. So we have that situation where even though it's pretty much split between liberal and conservative citizens in America, and so you see it going back and forth. Bush was a relative conservative, he's a Republican conservative, Obama a liberal Democrat, Trump a conservative Republican, and the way things going, it will probably be a Democrat, if not in this next election, in the next election where there's not an incumbent, probably odds are it'll be a Democrat, because that's the way it's been going. Conservative, liberal, so it's kind of an odd situation. There are obviously some people in the middle who don't like anything, so they get mad at the Democrats and they vote Republican, and then they get mad at the Republicans and they vote Democrat. Anyway, so back and forth. So if you go back a little further, it even goes on further than that. Back from when I was quite young, you had Eisenhower Republican, Kennedy was a Democrat. He got killed. His vice president became the president. Nixon was a Republican. Then Jimmy Carter was a Democrat. Then Reagan was a Republican. Then Bush did. So there was another Republican, Bush, Daddy Bush, was elected. So we had a situation with two Republicans in a row. Then Clinton was a Democrat. Then Bush was a Republican. Then Obama was a Democrat. Then Trump was a Republican. So back and forth. It's very evenly split in America and divided emotionally right now. So what I was getting to ultimately was that there are a lot of people who don't want to send their children to public school because they don't think they're going to be taught the values that they possess as a family. So at least 1 million families in America have opted out of school, out of the public school, and teach at home. Different states have different requirements. They might require that you take a national test every year to compare your progress to those in school and make sure that you're keeping up. Others choose to go to a private school. There are a lot of private schools run by churches. Other private schools, not at all. The churches, they're more just like there's some that are just basically for rich people. There are some that emphasize athletics. So a lot of the best athletes go to a private school, and then they go on to university and so forth. So this interview, two people. One was an interview of the superintendent, the top person in a local school system. So he oversaw not just one school, but maybe being in Tampa, he may have overseen 50 schools. So the superintendent oversees all the local schools in that district. And the other interview was of the head of a private school. What you will, if you were to go through this, you see that one of the areas of contention is that citizens have to pay taxes to support the public school, even if they put their children into a private school. And so in some cases, there are probably at least another 1 million parents across America who would put their children into private school if they could afford to do it, but they can't afford to do it because they're paying taxes to support the public school that they don't want to go to. So that's the essence of the conflict. So you kind of understand that as I look through here. Okay, so what I wanted to do then was go ahead and actually show you how I would go through this. So I think I set the stage as to what this is all about. If I were doing it electronically, I might color the different. I'd go through first off and decide what are the different things. Are there different pieces of this that should go first or second or whatever? What is, again, as I said, the first thing I want is to find the whammy. Because public education is the norm, that's not a very good whammy. So the argument for having some sort of a tax break, some sort of tax credit for those who send their children to a private school, that's news. That's more news. So that's the one I would choose to lead with, is the argument for why they should have some sort of a tax break. So in going through this, I did go through it a little bit ahead of time, so I wouldn't bore you too much to death. So this whole argument here on that Xiamen is the public school superintendent. I might use most of that in one setting once I get into it, pretty much. So I'm going to make that yellow. But that's not the most important one. The more important one to me is Harrington, because he's the one that's different. So even though it's first in order, I actually, in my list here, I marked it B. That's not what I'm going to start with. But then once I get started, then I'll go into his argument against it. And I'm going to mark this one here. This is within this, there is, if I mark it twice, I think it's a little darker. No, that did undid. Okay, mark it a little bit different color. Okay, this is the most interesting quote he had within his, but that's still not the lead. That's not the whammy. But I still want to set it off that this is, there's two sides of the story, and this is kind of the whammy of the second side of the story in favor of public schools. This one is the second side of the story, obviously. And so I'm going to mark that a different color. And I'll go with light blue in that, I guess. Oops, I didn't. No. But out of that also, I have kind of a whammy chosen from that area. So out of this second perspective on it, it is in here. There are literally millions of parents in this country who would send their children to private school if they could afford to do so. That's not a direct quote, that's an indirect quote. Why can't they afford to? Because they have to pay taxes. So I want to go and choose another color to mark that with. So I'm going to go, I guess, with this color, another shade of blue. So this part here, I want, this is probably my actual lead. That's the material I have for a lead, and I just unmarked some of it. I'm using OpenOffice, and it works a little different. No, this is RealOffice. I originally was working on this with OpenOffice, which is the free version of Office, basically. Get down here, then now the superintendent of the public schools wants to respond, and so he has a counter argument, and so I'll count that a different color. And then the private school leader has yet another counter argument, and so that's would be another color. So I think I'll do that a gray. So I've kind of gone through kind of different subjects or different priorities, and my priority is actually the second one here, Harrington, and this being the whammy, I think. And then going to Xiamen, and this being his whammy. So it's not, so this, for example, might be paragraph 2. Remember, I want a complete lead, and I want to reflect both ideas in the complete lead. So the lead is going to take the perspective of the private school superintendent, and the second paragraph, or it might even be the third paragraph. So it may be a longer, it may be 3 paragraphs to the complete lead. But anyway, after I feel like I've said what I need to say about the private school position, then I will have the counter immediately reflect the counter argument by the public school superintendent. And I might just go ahead and continue. My leaning for is to go ahead and continue with the complete argument against private school, starting with what's in green and then using the rest of the material that I think is relevant, and then go more deeply into the argument by Xiamen, or by Harrington, by the private school person. So I've led it with him, but I'm going to wait a little bit, maybe. I don't know, even as I'm saying it, that doesn't make sense to me. So I might, so I think probably I won't. I'm probably going to jump, but I might give 2 paragraphs to the public school before I jump. So I might be 5 paragraphs into it before I cover what's in blue here, besides the dark blue. and then go to the counter and the counter. Okay, so actually doing it. So this is all background. I'm going to keep some of the stuff I need. And so we have that person and we have this person. I want to keep their titles handy here. So I'll keep that and get rid of any other junk I don't need there. Okay, so the lead. As I said, I was going to emphasize what's in blue. I'm going to grab that and I'm just going to bring that up to the top. I'm going to do some rewording and stuff. Oops. So I'm going to take it right out of there and move it up to the top to create my lead. I'm going to go ahead and take off the coloring now after I've made it all, everything colored. I don't want that to be in the way. Oops. So I will make no color. Usually, as I said, the lead would be an indirect quote, not a direct quote. So I might start with maybe with millions. So millions of parents in this country would send their children to private schools if they could afford to do so, says Dr. George Harrington, director of, I'll take some of that stuff out. Director of maybe, this is a little bit of, I hesitate, I mentioned the other day at using words like prestigious or beautiful or whatever, because they are objective, I mean, they're subjective. Not everybody, I mean, in this case, if it really could be, if everybody in the city knows that Stafford Preparatory School is prestigious, then I might feel free to do that. If there's any question at all, I would not. Director of the prestigious private school. Actually, I could go with just with private. But that does raise a question of why can't they afford to? And he answered that question in the direct quote. And so, as I said, I might, in a sense, be developing a 4-paragraph long complete lead, and keeping that direct quote in might be appropriate in setting up this debate, so to speak, between the two sources. So I think I will leave it there. Either that, or I could go ahead and add a little bit more information up here and say they could afford to do so, says da da da, and then just put in indirect quote, but they, I don't know, I think the direct quote is better. So I'm going to go ahead and leave the direct quote. I'm going to make this a type 3, put his attribution in, and oops, I should have put in a verb of attribution there. And I'll put one down here. AP style is just to use last name, so just says Harrington. This happened in Tampa, Florida, so I'm going to go ahead and write it like it was in Tampa, Florida. So So in setting up the counter argument, well, I probably need to put in here that Harrington, like say, says Harrington in supporting a proposal to provide those parents with a tax deduction or credit. So we set up what he's in favor of. So now it makes more sense. We can go ahead and take the counter argument, a brief counter argument. Disagrees with the proposal. There's nothing wrong with a real short paragraph. I told you that one sentence is okay. So I'm gonna. What I usually do is I make, if I have an indirect quote, I make that separate from a direct quote. And so I'm gonna the next paragraph will be the direct quote, and it will be a separate paragraph. So here we have quite a short paragraph here, but again, once you put it into a 2-inch wide column, it's going to be at least 2 lines, and probably 3 lines, even though it seems quite short. Probably it might fit on 2 lines. It's really close to 3 lines. I'll go ahead and pull this one out. I mentioned as kind of the whammy of the counter argument. And so exemption and credits are ways of indirectly giving public subsidy to private schools. Once you've done that, you have made them public schools. And the public taxes may then begin paying for things with which the majority strongly oppose. Maybe use a type 3. The other one is type 2. This is type 3. Put a comma here, quotation mark. He says, period. And then quotation mark again. Once you've And I think in order to explain this, I need another paragraph. So that's why I probably thought I should maybe even put all of this in. I think at least that was kind of boring. I think we set it up that some people are going to disagree with some types of schools, for example, in having the public support them. So I think I'll pick it up from that point, which is down here. I'm going to pick this up and go up, plop that in there. Okay, so now we have a quote to support his point. If you're a Protestant, you would disagree, let's say, with subsidizing Catholic schools or Muslim schools, for example. If you are liberal, you would object to subsidizing extreme right-wing conservative schools. I would be, because this is kind of debate, this is where I might be tempted to use a verb of attribution that's not says. I will. So in my argument that you should always use says, and some editors, like I say, insist on it, once in a while I might break that in order to create, I'm using it in this case to kind of create this sense of debate. And so I am, argues Xiamen. Indirect quote, I think, is right where we have it here. These schools ought to be permitted to exist because of our belief in freedom of speech, but they shouldn't. But we shouldn't subsidize them. Okay, a caution here. I see this a lot with student writers. We can't say we unless it's in a direct quote. And I say here that this is an indirect quote. So we need to take that out of there and replace that with a third person reference. And this is an indirect quote, so we want to go with type 1. He says these schools ought to be permitted to exist because of I guess America's belief in freedom of speech, but taxpayers shouldn't subsidize them. That puts it back in third person. Democracy is not supporting every crackpot idea that comes along, and schools in a democracy must try to represent a polyglot group of people, all faiths, all religions, all persuasions. I'll probably put in the attribution here. If we allow private education to factionalize our nation, we will find no peace, no compromise, no common understanding among our citizens. So again, comma, quotation mark. Yes, put as, I don't want to, I like go every other, when I have a string of paragraphs, I typically go use the person's name, then I use a pronoun, then I use their name and so forth. So there's no, so it's not confusing. So I'm going to go back to Xiamen says. Oops. Okay, this kind of requires a response, and if so I'm ready to go to the other side again. The other person, I do not have in my notes that he specifically addressed this last sentence, and yet it kind of deserves a response. And probably in my discussion with him, it was clear what he would say. So I think sometimes an indirect quote or paraphrase can represent, even if you didn't put it in your notes, you can think about it later and say, you know, he's talked enough. We don't have everything he said here, but he talked enough that it is fair to say that you know, to make an appropriate response to this. If we allow private education to factionalize our nation, we will find no peace, no compromise, no common understanding among our citizens. But Harrington, again, making it like a debate, counters that if you have two words that one after the other, AP style says put a comma between it, that, and this is one of those situations where it does feel like you should put two that's together, but maybe not. I can read it to myself here. I'll go ahead and finish the sentence and then come back and decide whether I need two that's. But Harrington counters that should not come at the expense of parents' right parents' right to raise their children according to their own beliefs and values. So this is, there wasn't a direct quote on this, but this would be an appropriate, it mixes in, it reflects his position. And so I think it's fair to put in there. So now we go back into Harrington and try to find then something that kind of reflects that. Okay, it looks like coming down here is what best reflects that. So if so this, move that up. The other side of the story is if you have a direct quote and it doesn't quite flow well, you can manipulate it. First off, you can cut words out without a problem at all. There's no ethical question at all as far as cutting words out. That's your duty as a reporter to make things flow well, and so cutting a few words out is not a question. The question is, can you add a word and not put it in parentheses or brackets or something? From my experience, first off, almost if somebody's not using a recorder, they're always off a little bit. I've tested that with myself, and it's kind of interesting because I've taken notes and I've done the recording, and then I've written my story on my notes. I figured I have enough of my notes. I don't want to listen to the recording. But then I go back and listen to the recording just to see how accurate I was. And I find out that I've missed some words. There's a few words here, there's a few words that they're not the same. The essence of the quote that I wrote down, in my notes was accurate, but it was not word perfect accurate. It was almost, but there were at least a couple words off. And it's my belief that that's true for anybody not using a tape recorder. That unless you are, in fact, I asked the question of one of my earliest surveys. Actually, I was still doing my bachelor's degree, and I don't think it was for a class. I think it was just out of curiosity. I surveyed some newspaper editors and asked about what they thought should be taught in a university. And one of the things that I included was shorthand. You know what shorthand is? Shorthand it's not used anymore because they now use recorders and have and so forth. But before, I don't know, at least for many decades, secretaries would learn a short way of writing that if you looked at it, you wouldn't know what they were writing. They had a very short way of doing it, that they could do it really fast, and so they were trained in shorthand so they could take dictation from their boss or whoever and get it pretty much word perfect. And so at the time that I did this questionnaire, a lot of secretaries were still using shorthand. There's one professional system that secretaries use, but there's also been other systems that aren't quite as rigorous, quite as short, but allow you to shorten your writing and speed up your note taking. Anyway, so I asked the editors if they would like their reporters to know shorthand, and the vast majority that said no, 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 no We don't have time for that. In other words, and so those same, I can guarantee those same editors would not want a tape recorder, or at least they would not want you to try to transcribe a tape recorder. I think that was mostly opposed by daily newspaper editors who think that you just don't have time to be that precise. You can't. And so there's been some other surveys done since then. So basically the editors are saying they don't want you to be that precise. They don't want you to be word perfect. Even a direct quote might be off a little bit. And so what I've always taught my students is if you are close enough that 2 days later your source will not know if you're right or wrong, you're close enough. And if you think about it, think about a conversation you had with a friend at lunch today. Could you honestly say if we changed a couple of words per sentence and didn't change the meaning of it, would you know whether my notes were correct or not correct? Probably not, even just a few hours ago, let alone 2 days ago. And in fact, I've written stories based on my notes, and I've had people gush. I don't know if you know that word. Gush should just be effusive in their praise of how accurate I am. And yet I know from my own self-experimentation, I'm not word perfect accurate. I'm good. I'm really good at it. But I'm not word perfect accurate. And yet my people I was quoting absolutely embellished, they were just loved the way I wrote the story, and they were sure they just thought I was perfect. And when I know I'm not. I did not use my tape recorder in that case. It was all from my notes. So what I'm getting to is this. If I know there's no way they can check on me, they don't have a tape recording, and there weren't other people in the room taking notes and stuff, I might change a word or two and not apologize for it, not put brackets around it, and just make it harder for somebody to read, because I know everybody else is taking notes. They're not as accurate as I am. And so if I need to change one word or two words, I'm not going to worry about it. I'm going to do it. Now, is that ethical? I don't know. I think it is. I haven't changed the meaning, and they don't know the difference. What's the difference? So anyway, going to this. So here we have, he's starting off the sentence. Sorry, I should blow this up a little bit. You're going to having trouble seeing this. I can't blow it that much, but in so doing, that just doesn't fit in. It doesn't make sense here. So there's, it might actually become part of this as part of an indirect quote with the previous sentence. This is clearer here. If we really believed in freedom of speech, press, religion, and individual conscience, we would break up this monopoly situation. We would keep public schools going for all who wish to attend, but we would make it feasible for more parents to transfer their children to private schools if that is their desire. So I have a choice here, and actually probably the better choice is just simply cut out that first sentence. We don't really need it. That doesn't quite fit in the flow of it. And so although we could, that sentence maybe as an indirect quote up here, this ends up making it a type 3. I'm going to put it before his attribution. If there's only a few words before the attribution in an indirect quote, that's okay. The reader's not going to get too confused. So even though I say an indirect quote should start with type 1, your attribution at the start, if it's just a few words before the attribution, you can get away with it. So in here, I'd say is that really freedom? So then in that I say asks, and this is all still considered direct or indirect quote, because I did change that a little bit. So all ethical questions aside, put aside, I left it as an indirect quote, where that should not come at the expense of parents' rights. So we bring up this. So in so doing, are we really supporting? Now I have another. Oh, that's right. We were going to cut this out. So now with that out, it makes sense. If we really believed in freedom of speech, press, we would break up this monopoly situation. This is where I would be tempted to change the wording slightly and not tell my readers, because it's what he's intended to say. But one of the more ethical, but not, it doesn't flow as well, is to put things in bracket if you change it. We would break up but to clarify, public school monopoly and take situation out. Again, I think I'll go with type 3. Okay, so that's, again, the most ethical way is putting it in brackets, but it does disrupt the flow a little bit because readers aren't expecting brackets to show up, and some don't even understand why it's in brackets. But nobody's taught them if we put it in brackets, that's not exactly what they said, and so it actually can cause more confusion, and which is why I am tempted not to put brackets around it, even though that means I purposely changed their quote slightly. That's an ethical question I'll let you deal with. This is most editors would say you should do it this way. I question, like I say, I'm not even sure, as I said a second ago, I'm not even sure that the reader understands what that means. And so you put in a couple of brackets, you might actually confuse them and cause them to pause. And yet, again, this is a situation where I would bet that Harrington would not know I changed it if I put in public school monopoly. He would not read, it's basically what he said. And if I'm that far off only, he would not care and would probably not know. So I'm being totally honest with you. Okay, so now do we go back to Xiamen? And I think we can. Actually, I didn't originally plan it this way, but we've gotten into this argument of whether, and so this kind of becomes a counter argument from Xiamen. I want to use the rest of his quotes there in this location. And so I'll bring that up. Oops, wrong direction. This is where I would put an indirect quote. I need to come up with what it would be, probably make it from this first direct quote, but we need a transition. So I'm quoting Harrington. Now I need to let the readers know very clearly we're moving back to Xiamen again. So I'm going to start right off, definitely with a type 1 indirect quote here. Xiamen says it is in the national interest to protect the public school system. And then the indirect quote. Our public school system is essential to the American system of democracy, justice, and equal opportunity. He says, another type 3. I believe private schools have the right to exist and have a proper, he already said this one, and so this is where I would, also one of the questions that when somebody says, I believe, and then they go on and tell you what they believe, the very fact that they're saying it means they believe it. And so I very frequently take out, I believe, I think, something like that. It's just wordiness that we don't need because they just said it. Obviously, they believe it. So take it out. So I'm going to take off what he already said. They have the right to exist. They already said that. He already said that. And this is definitely somewhere where I'm just going to put, well, I'm basically taking out some words. I'm going to say private schools. And again, here's another ethical question. Do you put ... When you take stuff out of a quote, do you put ellipses in there to show you took stuff out? I would say most reporters agree that that's not necessary in newspaper writing. If you went to the White House and you were a reporter for the White House, for the president, and you have 100 other reporters there, you probably better put ... if you take stuff out, because somebody else is going to use the same quote and they're going to put ... or something, and suddenly there's going to be people accusing you of monkeying with the quote. So there are certain circumstances where you don't dare monkey with the quote. If somebody's recording it, somebody has it on TV, there's 100 reporters all taking notes on the same event. However, let me make note that frequently reporters, after the president talks, will get together if he hasn't given them a copy of his speech, or even if it's not the president, it's the president's public affairs person. They will get together and agree on what that person said. In other words, they don't know for sure what the public affairs person said, but they're going to agree with each other that she said this. So they themselves know that their reporting is not exactly right. And so they're just talking to each other, trying to make it they don't want to be embarrassed. So they're agreeing on what she said, even though none of them might be right. Because they took notes, they did not record it. So my point is that in here, what I was looking at here, private schools have the right, have a proper place in our society. Yeah, I think there was something there I was going to make a slight change on. Anyway, if it's a very, very, we're talking about the ellipses. So I took a couple of words out of this quote ahead of private schools, and I took a few out after private schools. And so the question I asked was, should I put ellipses in there? I wouldn't if nobody was recording me, or there's nobody going to dispute. And obviously those few words, the speaker, the person I interviewed, is not going to argue about it. He's not going to notice that small change. You definitely don't want to take somebody out of context and destroy the essence of what he was trying to say. That is the worst thing you can do as a reporter. So you do not want to ever do that. Take somebody and basically say they said something they did not mean to say because you've monkeyed with their quote. It's definitely no, ever, never. That is first-degree murder or something, yeah, in this field. So you want to make sure that you're reflecting what they said. But if it's just a small change you've made, taking a few words out, words out there, and nobody else has the recording except you. Yeah, it's just to put dots in is like those brackets that I put in. It just slows up the reading, and if it didn't change anything, I don't bother. I don't bother with it. That's my stand on it. And this one I feel stronger about than I do about the bracket one where I put the brackets in, because in this case it definitely did not change the meaning, and all the words I used were there. I just took some out. So I'm not going to worry about putting ellipses in. Okay, so here's an indirect quote. It's pretty good the way it is. So I'm going to go ahead and leave it like that. We'll make it type 1. I used a he in the previous one, so I'm going to go to his name. Xiamen says it's no different than paying taxes for garbage, fire protection, so forth. If someone wants to take his own garbage to the dump, fight his own fires, or hire private detectives to protect his home, that's his right, but we can't make an exception to taxation for every individual who wants to go his own way. We will put that a type 2 attribution at the end. Okay. I don't think this part here that was a indirect quote I've already kind of said it already previously. I'm going to cut that out. This ends on a good place in a sense, because now Harrington had a response to that specifically. I can sympathize with the president's or the superintendent's position. So I'm going to put that up there. And now I think I can put this whole thing up in that area, which I guess I'll just take off the blue, take out those words. What we do, again, we're changing sources. So again, I need to have a type 1 indirect quote to make that shift into a new person. We can't let the reader be confused as to who's talking here. So I need a type 1 indirect quote to shift to to Harrington again. So this direct quote could turn into an indirect quote. So I think I will make that an indirect quote. So started off with Harrington. Says he can sympathize with the superintendent's position. And then, so again, a really short paragraph. Then a quote. He is afraid that the eroding tax base in the city will lead to a critical budget crunch within a few years, if not months. He says, I think I'll skip this one because then we have another direct quote. Maybe I'm going to cut this so I can bring it out of memory if I need it. I'm going to just cut it. And I might go ahead and bring this up to that paragraph, at least part of this paragraph is kind of long, so I might break it at a different spot. But his position on this subject is not even rational. So I'm going to bring that down here. Now in English in America, if you have two paragraphs, one after the other of direct quote, we don't put an end quote after the first one. So right here, we do not put an end quote. We just go ahead with the next quote and then let it end it. So I'm not putting a quotation mark here. That is, at least in America, that's what we're taught. And so but we're going on where the quotation is continuing. So we're not talking about garbage collection. We're talking about a fundamental right of every parent to bring up his child as he sees fit. Comma, direct quote. Harrington says. Again, you'll notice that because there is no time frame in this, I'm using present tense like a magazine would. And many of yours might go that way. Because again, before it ends up in a newspaper, the student newspaper, it may not, a story like this might wait till next semester or next year, because it's not time sensitive. So using the present tense, we'll leave it timeless. It has no tie to time whatsoever. Okay, how would the public react to a proposal to have all children taken out of the home and raised by the state? We wouldn't stand for it, but the position of public school supporters is almost the same. Okay. And this is an indirect quote. But I use the words "we" are in there, so I need to change that. He argues that if the government gives parents a tax break, maybe when instead of if, when they transfer their children to private schools, the public schools would still have the support of not only their students' parents, but also all of the non-parents in their district. In a sense, that is still a little unfair, but we would be, why is it unfair? Oh, unfair to the, and I'm not sure I think that's confusing. Maybe pick it up here. Let me make it clear that we do not want any direct government subsidy, because that direct subsidy comes with controls. I'll go to type 3 again. Harrington says, oops, get a comma in there. Period in this case, because it's a new sentence. We don't want their red tape, their headaches, their manipulations, their strings, their values, or their methods. We don't want anything over us that would dictate what we do here. And this one might again go without an end quote, because and just go on to the next one. Notice this one has 3 sentences in it, and that, according to my criteria, my critique sheet, is the maximum you can have, 3 sentences in a paragraph. So that's a reason why I'm not going to bring this one up and put it in the same paragraph, as I keep my own rule. Those three sentences are actually going to look quite long. That the one that I just finished. There's only three sentences, but that will probably be about that long in a two column or 2 inch wide column. So even that may look a little bit foreboding, a little bit like, ooh, I don't know if I want to get into a paragraph that long, even though there's only three sentences. So that is pretty much the maximum length I'd want a paragraph in a newspaper. When you go to a magazine, if you have wider, this is all about the way it looks, because people respond to the way it looks. So again, this is part of an editing class that I've taught previously. Narrow columns, shorter paragraphs. Wider columns, longer paragraphs. It's the visual of it, the graphic effect of it. And so newspapers are typically very narrow. We want shorter paragraphs for that. Okay, so I do need to put an attribution in here. The federal government has succeeded in fouling up public education already. We don't want it destroying private education as well. Okay, I want to make sure that you understand the difference in punctuation when you're breaking one sentence in half to make a type 3, or making two sentences into a type 3 quotation. So I mentioned up here was type 3. Type 3 here, you have a comma, quotation mark. Harrington says period, and then start a new sentence, capitalized, and with the quotation mark and a capital letter on we. Here we have the opposite situation. So the federal government has succeeded in fouling up the public education already, end quote. He says, actually this could be a separate sentence. I didn't have it that way. Or it could be a semicolon instead of a period. But let's say we want to keep it. I want to demonstrate this anyway. I'm going to say this is part of the same sentence, although technically it's not. So without a, maybe I need to add the word and to it, a conjunction. So in this case, if we're going to keep it the same sentence, we put a comma, not a period, after the attribution. So up here, we had a period. Here, we're going to have a comma. So quotation mark. And in order to make it grammatically correct, I'm going to put and in there. And we don't want it destroying private education as well. So the federal government has succeeded in fouling up public education already, he says, and we don't want it destroying private education as well. Okay, so that is a compound sentence. We talked about being careful with compound sentences. I think this is short enough and clear enough that it's not a problem. So again, note this has a comma because it's splitting a sentence. This here has a period because it's separating two sentences. Got it? Everybody? Okay, so we're almost done here. I think some of you are bored, but I'm trying to put you in my mind, that you see inside my mind of how I write a story, so you can use the same technique. This is not that hard. Yes, we've taken over an hour or so to do this, but an hour is not long for your homework. Once you kind of get down this technique, how to organize, how to flow between different perspectives and so forth, then writing a new story isn't really hard. If you have good quotations, good direct quotes and indirect quotes in your notes, it's a matter of what order do I put them in. So that's what I was trying to do by colorizing them and thinking about them kind of out loud with you guys. I made a few changes as I went into it. I'd colorized them and then, I've changed my mind. I want to do this, whatever. I mean, you're the writer. You have that prerogative of changing your mind. But you have to, before you start writing, you should think, okay, what's the whammy? that I'm going to use for the entire story. If I'm going to transition then to a second source, what's the most important thing he says or she says? This case might be. So how am I going to transition, have kind of a second whammy? And then just how do I flow back and forth? Again, the other thing I'm trying to demonstrate here is how to use indirect quotes to guide your story. And so I hope that's clear also, that the indirect quotes I used made a smooth transition from one speaker to another speaker, from one idea to another idea. Those indirect quotes become very, very important in making your story flow smoothly. And so that's what you do. You use your indirect quotes or paraphrases, essentially the same thing, to do that. They are the ones that are transitioning from one idea to another idea, transitioning from one person to another person, and making your stories flow smoothly. Okay, here's an indirect quote that Xiamen is going to respond to, so I need to leave it in for sure. Private school students and even homeschool students average higher on standardized tests than public schools. And so this is again an indirect quote. So I'm going to go keep my critique, my instructions, and put the attribution to start. And then Xiamen responds to that. And that first one is indirect quote. So again, in the spirit of debate, I'm going to try to make a debative sort of transition. Says that's not a fair comparison. The demographics in a mostly white private school and a more diverse public school are totally different and cannot be compared. Children who go to private schools are typically from more affluent families. Okay, here most of the stuff is good to keep, but not in one paragraph. Again, 3-sentence maximum. So I'd go ahead and put it here. This is a case where you might not have to stay with type 1 in an indirect quote, because here's a very short sentence here. So you can go to he says here. You might want to make sure that it's clear. Private school students own computers, he says. They usually have attended high quality preschools and have a stay-at-home parent reading and teaching them at home before they even start school, and then provide strong support after they enter school. Okay, everything is third person, so that's okay. Quote, that's not always the case in public schools where we accept everyone. This is an ultra long compound sentence that I'm thinking about. That's why I paused here, but I'm going to go ahead and read it to myself. That tells me whether or not I think it's going to confuse anybody. So I read things out loud, even if it's not in front of a class. That's not always the case in public schools where we accept everyone, and where some children come from single parent homes or homes where parents are working 2 jobs apiece just to put food on the table and pay the rent. That's a very long sentence, multi-compound sentence. It seems to me to flow well. If I change it, then we get back. The only way I can change it is to either turn part of it into an indirect quote or put some words in there that aren't there. Which again, we go back to the ethical question. Do I put words in there in order to shorten it? Do I put words in there? For example, I could say where we accept everyone and where some children come from single parent homes. So I could stop there and start with or, and then put something like or, and then or there. Parents are working 2 jobs apiece just to put food on the table and pay the rent. So here's another question. Ethical to do that and not put it in brackets. I would just leave it like this, no brackets. Okay, I see no reason to put brackets in there and slow people's, confuse them further and slow up their reading. When all I added really was the word or, and there. I guess or there. I added 2 words, or there, and shortened the sentence. I'm not going to worry about it, so I'm going to leave it. Or their parents and us. That is precisely why we must not undermine the financial support of public schools. And I'll put this, make this with a type 2 attribution at the end. Xiamen says. And then the final response. Again, we're in a situation where we're changing the source, and so I need an indirect quote probably to do that. But I can just you can call a direct quote an indirect quote. Nobody's going to, so even though it's actually a direct quote, doesn't mean you have to use it as a direct quote. So in this case, it might be easiest to just change that direct quote into an indirect quote, even though it's a direct quote. Who's going to care? Again, you're not even, there's no ethical violation of saying it's an indirect quote when it's a direct quote. So in this case, then Harrington says that's begging the question. That's a term, I don't know if you're not familiar with it. It's kind of like it's not the right question. That's kind of setting up a question that isn't relevant to this argument. It's kind of what he's saying. So, quote, then, parents want their children to be educated according to their standards and values, and private school students are doing very well. The government has no basis on which to deny tax breaks or tax credits so that parents can exercise that choice. Make this a type 3. And then here's an indirect quote from my notes. I'll probably leave it pretty much the same. As for the students who stay in public school, they will benefit by having more taxpayer dollars per student to improve their education, buy more computers and software for the school. This one I think I might make. I told you before, it's nice to have something to make it sound like you have a conclusion. What did I do here? Without it being you trying to make a conclusion yourself. So what I was saying was I wanted to maybe that little indirect quote I did something weird here. Not sure what I did. I took out part of that indirect quote. Let me put it back in and see if it makes a good conclusion. Okay. I apparently somehow accidentally took out part of this quote. Students who stay in the public school. Okay, so up here we need an attribution. Here I'm going to take as for the off. Harrington says students who stay in public school will, it's an indirect quote, so there's no ethical question here, will benefit maybe go to would actually benefit by having more taxpayer dollars per student to improve their education, buy more computers and software, and buy, I do need an end in there, and buy more computers and software for the school. Quote, the government spends more than $12,000 per student in the public schools, not counting school construction. Citizens, I'm going to do a type 3 again here, oops, comma, quote, he says, period, quotation mark. Citizens pay that through a separate bond levy, and all citizens will continue paying for those bonds. If private school parents could get a tax deduction or credit worth $6,000, they would be happy. And that would leave more money for students who stay in public schools. I think that was the original quote. I don't think I'm actually changing that, but retrieving it. Okay, actually that quote makes a nice conclusion anyway. I think I'll stop there. Okay, so I took the whole class, but it's a nice long story. If you can take notes that are somewhat, you have an interesting subject first off, and you take good notes, some indirect, some direct, so forth, and can go use that thinking process, it shouldn't take too long to write the story and make it pretty good. You want to be able to, again, emphasize the most interesting aspects of it. So that's looking for your whammy, for your whoever you're going to take the lead. Probably, I mean, it is possible to put both people in a lead. I don't think it'll be quite as strong in this case. And so I used what I thought was a lead from one of the sources, and then went back to the second source. If you recall, in essence, I would call the first 4 paragraphs the complete lead here, in a sense, because it reflects, it takes that long to really tell the reader what this story is all about, to represent both sides adequately. So if I were to, and there's not a whole lot of and there's no when or where element to the story. So because this is a timeless story, and the when and where were irrelevant. Where I interviewed them, when I interviewed them, doesn't matter here. I'm taking a magazine style towards it, using present tense attribution and so forth. And so I've automatically eliminated some of the stuff that you would normally put in paragraph 2. When and where are gone. We already have the who. We have the what. We have some how in it, whatever, and why. And so we have 4 W's covered in this story, and that may be true for your story as well if you leave it timeless. Not only are you trying to avoid the when it happened, when you interviewed, for a story that might run sometime in the future, but also where, if it's not real relevant, because where kind of pushes you to a when. If you say, once you say where something happened, it's just in the mind of the reader, they're asking when is at the same time. So if you're doing a timeless story like this, you leave the where out and the when out, um, so that you don't, so that doesn't come into the reader's mind. You leave those two out because they're not relevant. But you're covering the who, what, why, and how. Basically, that's what you're emphasizing with this. Any questions on that? I'm going to put the notes up on the up on Moodle and this final version, this story, so you can kind of look at them. Maybe it might help you to kind of see what I did. Um, anyway, any questions? I just wanted to, so this is another example. This is probably the best example. The other examples I've given you of what you're expected to do, all were a little bit different situations that didn't quite probably match with what most of you will do. Most of you will go interview two people about essentially one subject. The one I have with the that comes with the critique sheet was for another class where I had them using multiple sources, but it was all kind of basically I was having them write stories based on what we talked about in class, was that one. And so they were pretending that certain people, the textbook author was here talking to us, and they were putting that stuff together. And that's, they're pretending that there was a conference here on campus and stuff. So they made up some of that stuff, and so it's not really quite. It's kind of, I mean, you can kind of see the flow and so forth, but it's a multi-source, which makes it even a little more complicated, and also leads to breaking some of the rules that I otherwise have given you. The other one was broken pretty much just in two halves. If you recall, the other example I gave you was, first off, the mom talking about the death of her daughter caused by the gang, and then the police officer giving some of the facts about local gang activity. Well, that was not this complicated. So that was probably the least complicated example, because we had the story, the not an anecdote would be the right way, but the story to catch your interest and make your emotions to some extent, and then the police officer coming in and giving you the facts. And it's a very cut and dried one source, then another source. Very simple story. But most of you aren't going to have that situation. If some of you do, that's great. You can use that as your example. But this one is more likely to be what you're going to be doing in this class. And so I wanted to give you an example anyway. So I thought, well, I'll just do the example here in front of you so you can see how I would do the sort of story you're probably going to be doing for the class. Okay? Any questions? If not, we're past time, or at time, whatever. Again, I'll put these both on Moodle so you can compare them and kind of remind yourself of how I went about writing this story. Okay? Okay, thank you.